give me, and I'm just going to encapsulate and summarize for a couple people that joined in late. You mentioned biomechanics, you mentioned form, and then you mentioned the progression, the proper progression for training.
That's right.
As sort of the pillars of the three-legged stool, if you will. Maybe give me your top 2 or 3, and they could be either running errors or in terms of what you see running, and or shoe fit errors, other than the obvious going for just a glitzy, techno shoe. It could be either of those. What are some of the biggest things that you see that maybe not everybody knows about, or that you think are really important to emphasize, to the running community?
Right. So I would say foot strike placement is probably the biggest error that people make in terms of form. And what I mean by that is the tendency to land with their heel in front of their hip, especially going downhill, especially steep downhills. There's a natural tendency to kind of want to lean back and get your feet out in front of you on steep downhills to control speed. But that actually puts a tremendous amount of torque and stress into your legs to do it that way. And so if you reference that video that I mentioned, the Chi running, it gives an excellent description of what proper form is and what your foot strike should be.
And they talk about that too, sorry to interrupt, as the check mark that you see when you overextend with an over lengthy stride. Is that along the same lines as what you're saying?
That's correct, yes. And so I use as a little cue in my head when I'm running is like, I don't tie my shoes very tight. I think that, a lot of times people tie their shoes very tight in an attempt to kind of keep their foot from sliding around in the shoe. If your foot is sliding forward in the shoe, it's an indication that you're landing with your heel in front of your hip. If you land properly, if your foot strike, if your foot doesn't make contact with the ground until your heel is behind your hip, your foot will slide to the back of the shoe. It will hold to the back of the shoe, even if it's not tied very tight. So I tend to use that as a cue for myself. If I feel my foot starting to slide forward into the shoe, I feel like my form is starting to break down, and that's a cue for me to kind of tighten up my form. As far as like a common mistake that people make in terms of buying their shoes, the most common is that they buy the wrong size, or they misunderstand, as I mentioned earlier, what pronation is. They may read a description of what pronation is and mischaracterize their own biomechanics, and then find shoes that meet the needs of that mischaracterization. So the most common thing that people do is they kind of look and they see that they tend to wear the outside corner of their heel on a shoe, and they think, oh, like I underpronate. And so then they start, they buy shoes for underpronation, whereas that's just sort of a strike point. It doesn't indicate whether you pronate excessively or not. It really is not. It just means that you walk upright, basically. And so it's not an indication of what people often think it is. And so that's a common mistake that people make as well. They also tend to buy their shoes too tight. We have a saying that brains like tight shoes and feet like brooms. So there's a little bit of tension in that relationship. So people like their feet, their brain likes the idea that it knows where their feet are in space and that they're under control. But compressing the foot inside of a shoe and then doing a repetitive motion exercise like running on it causes a host of problematic damage to the foot over time.